Well, it's a forgotten story. It's even forgotten in America, and they've probably got good reason to forget it. But in the summer of 1779, the British suddenly sent 700 men, mostly Scotsmen, to a place called Majabigwadus, which was in Massachusetts.
I was wondering.
Yeah, Majabigwadus. It's now called Castine. And it was then in Massachusetts. There was no state of Maine. Now it's in the state of Maine. And their orders were to build a fort. The idea was that they were going to make a secure base for loyalist Americans who were looking for refuge from rebel persecution, and a place where the Royal Navy could have a base to patrol the coast, because the whole coast was infested by privateers who were preying on British cargo ships going to New York. And so there are 700 men there, and there are 3 Royal Naval ships. My interest in it started because one of the 700 was a very young, he was 18-year-old lieutenant called John Moore, and he became Lieutenant General Sir John Moore of the Battle of Corunna fame. And I thought that he might meet Sharp, but he never did. And I got completely sidetracked because when I was looking at Moore's life, I discovered that his very first taste of action had been at Majabigwadus in 1779. I'd never heard of it, never heard of the Penobscot expedition. Well, what happened was that the British get there, and then the state of Massachusetts, which is really virtually independent already. I mean, there are no British troops in Massachusetts until they land these 700 men, and they have their own judiciary, their own legislature. It's an independent state. They decide, we're going to get rid of them. And they assemble the largest fleet that the Americans assembled in the whole War of Independence, over 40 ships and 1,000 men, and they send them down east to Maine to get rid of them. And what follows is a disaster. Yet Massachusetts went into that war, and it really was Massachusetts declaring war on Britain rather than the rebels, with such confidence, so confident that they were selling shares in the outcome of the expedition and the plunder they expected to take. Yet it ended up it's probably the biggest naval disaster in American history before Pearl Harbor. Of the 42 ships that left Boston, only 1 survived. So it's an extraordinary story, which is made even, I think, more extraordinary. We have John Moore on the British side who's going to become famous, but on the American side there's somebody even more famous. And I think this is what got me into the story in the end, because the commander of the American artillery is a man called Paul Revere. Now, Paul Revere is such a soaring hero, certainly in New England. I mean, you go to Boston, there's that great equestrian statue. He's incredibly famous. He failed completely. This is the only time Paul Revere ever fought the British, those 3 weeks of the campaign. And at the end of it, he's put under house arrest and court-martialed for incompetence and cowardice. And I mean, the gap between myth and reality is so huge, it seemed worth exploring.
And so you're exploding a treasured American myth here. How has the book been received in the United States?
Well, I think it depends where you are. I mean, New England has not liked it very much, but outside of New England, and certainly in the South, they like it a lot because because it's trashing a Yankee, which is a national sport, south of the Mason-Dixon line. A lot of people have actually been very interested, and I'd have to say the reaction has been generous. And I think, I mean, the historians have always known this about Revere. They've always known that Revere was a false hero. What happened was that in 1860, Henry Longfellow wanted to write a great patriotic poem because he saw the country sliding into civil war. And I think he wanted to unite people, and he wanted to remind them of their revolutionary legacy. And he more or less plucked Revere's name at random. He was walking past the old granary graveyard in Boston. He saw the name on a stone, and a friend said, well, you know the story, don't you? And he didn't, and the friend told him the story, which he then changed. The story is the Midnight Ride, which is the ride to warn the Patriots so that the British were going to Concord. Well, that's nonsense. About 30 guys rode, and only one of them got stopped by the British, and guess who? It was Paul Revere. And none of that's in the poem, and the Brits stopped him from reaching Concord. And in fact, they let him go and kept his horse, which showed a pretty fine appreciation of his value. But Longfellow wasn't trying to write history. Longfellow was trying to write this great trumpet call of patriotism. And it worked. It worked very well. The great irony of this is that the man who brought the most serious court-martial charges against Revere was Longfellow's grandfather.
You've also set books in many other places during the 100 Years' War in the UK, in Saxon England, in 17th century London. How do you decide where you're going to go next?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's entirely capricious. I mean, it's really whatever interests me. I mean, I've always been interested in the story of Saxon England, or rather, how did England come about? I mean, you know, if you go to almost every other country's got a foundation myth.
Yeah, which is sort of what you're tackling in the fort with
Yeah,
Paul
I mean,
Revere.
you know, I live in the States now, and every July the 4th we have this wonderful Norman Rockwell parade, and it's, you know, it's great. I mean, it's balloons and bands, and everyone has a high old time. We don't have anything like that in England. And I always wanted to tell the story of how England was created, and it was the creation, of course, of Alfred the Great, his son and his daughter, and his grandson, and so that's the story I'm telling there. But I mean, that by itself is sort of frightfully portentous, and I mean, it could even be dull. I mean, you could think that most historical novels have a big story and a little story. And the big story is, can the South win the Civil War? The little story is, can Scarlett save Tara? And you flip them, right? So that the little story is in the foreground and the big story is in the background. So the big story is how did England come to exist? The little story is something entirely different.
Another sort of central tenet of England's myth of itself are the Arthur stories, the Arthur legend. And obviously you've written about that as well. And I gather that these are your favourite books, are the ones...
Well, yeah, I love the three Arthurian books. But there again, this sort of gap between myth and reality is so enormous. I mean, first, of course, we don't even know that Arthur existed. I mean, I'm fairly sure he did. Mentioning Arthur to serious historians is like sort of talking about healing crystals to the British Medical Association, you know. But if he was anything at all, he was a great Welsh hero. And his enemy were the English. And, you know, I think he's almost certainly the man who led the British forces at the Battle of Mountbatten, which we don't know where that was. We know it took place. There's plenty of evidence that it took place. Gildas mentions it, but he doesn't mention the name of the British leader. I think it was almost certainly was Arthur. And as such, he's one of the worst and most effective enemies the English ever had. And yet he's become this great hero in England. I mean, you mention England and Americans, oh, that's where King Arthur came from, isn't it? You know, the Round Table, wow. But in fact, you know, I mean, he was a Welshman and a very effective war leader.
But then that's very sad, isn't it? Because that means ultimately the English won. They conquered him, they took him for themselves.
They did, and I think that's probably the fault of women.
Really? Do go on.
Well, I think women are the transmitters of culture. They tell children the stories. And like any other society, when the Danes came into you know, and conquered northern England or northern Britain, I mean, the sensible thing to do is to leave the young women alive, because for obvious reasons. And then gradually their stories get assimilated into the new society. And I think what happened with Arthur is that even the Welsh women who were married into the Saxon told their children the stories of Arthur, and that's how it sort of got into the Saxon bloodstream. But yeah, women tell their children stories, and those stories is the culture. I mean, it's the stories you tell your children which tell your children who they are and where they come from, and they in turn will tell their children. I mean, what's even more interesting is that some of the earliest saints' lives, or the Celtic saints' lives, Arthur is a villain. He's a rapist, he's a thief, he's a murderer. Which is pretty obvious that the early church didn't like him at all. And it's obvious, too, that he wasn't looking for the Holy Grail, he was looking for a cauldron of Clydno or something. And the church, it seemed to me, fought him by having all these tales about how the saints were these great heroes and Arthur was the villain and the saints always win. And they couldn't win. I mean, the stories didn't have any effect. So they Christianized the stories in turn, and suddenly you've got Arthur as this sort of perfect Christian hero. So the poor guy is not only made from Welsh into English, he's also turned from pagan into Christian. And then eventually, you know, a damn Frenchman introduces adultery into a good British story. You know, and he ends up as this complete wimp. And yet Nennius, who's really the earliest person to talk about him, says he was the Dux Bellorum, the leader of battles. He was obviously a pretty fearful guy, not the sort of, you know, cuckolded wimp of... He should be played, you know, not by Sean Connery. I mean, he should be... Jack Nicholson should play him, really.
Yeah. Well, speaking of battles, and we're running out of time now, but I can't let you go without asking a question about your most famous creation, Sharp. You started writing these books back in 1980. Did you expect them to have such a long life?
No, I didn't. No, I really didn't. And in fact, I wrote the first Sharp series. I think it was over by about 1990, 91. And I really thought that was the end of it. And then television came along, and Sean Bean came along, and he got a new lease of life.
Did you write a backstory for him
Yes.
to explain Sean Bean's Yorkshire accent?
No, that was always in the books. And I keep on getting complaints and people saying, you know, that look, Sharp's from London and he can't possibly be from Yorkshire. And I say, right from the start it says that he went off to Yorkshire as a child. I don't know why. Never written that. But no, I mean, and Sean was wonderful. I mean, Sean was perfect Sharp.